It's too large a subject sometimes to cover in one presentation what the Singaporean model is. It's like saying trying to cover Indian history in a presentation. It's just not possible. But the focus of this presentation would be its politics and its housing, but also touching upon other features of its society. So, uh, I was born in 1980, and 1980 uh, was a period in which the economy in India had hit the doldrums. It was literally about 33 years after independence. And India followed a trajectory of every other Asian nation. That after colonial rule was about globalization and also trading in the larger uh, trading globally. So many Asian countries that were decolonizing had very, very bad experiences with empire. And not only British Empire, but with the Dutch, in Indonesia, French in Vietnam. The process of decolonization was very, very problematic. So, as a reaction against colonialism and colonial trade, all these nations closed down. Uh, and there was a distinct difference. Uh, in the 80s, in the 80s, all these countries began failing economically, India included. That they started going bankrupt. And, to grow up in the 1980s in India was like you had one TV channel, you had three cars, you didn't have much. But in 1991, there was a seismic shift in the politics of the country, in which, after almost 50 years of being independent, all across, and India was a late comer in this game, all across Asia, the countries began opening up to trade the way they were prior to their independence under the British Empire. They were also more politically confident, and their political systems were established. Uh, like this, for instance, is this is in 1995. It was Goa Police Bill that was passed. The Goa Police Bill basically follows the Singaporean model, in which private companies are allowed to take the role of the police. So if I apply for a uh, license to run auxiliary police, I can go and start policing society by a private company. Now this is goes against like any logical thought, right? How can I start a private company and uh, start policing society? So this you can, if you see 1995, it is a period in which then our society in India is looking at a certain model, like how does one open up to global trade? The model they're looking at is Singapore. And this is a bill brought by the ex-chief minister Pratap Singh Rani, who is considered a moderate. He's considered a moderate man. He's considered an old school, genteel politician. And suddenly he brings this like astonishingly, uh, how do you say, a problematic legislation. Okay? But then he goes a step further. Like a moderate man like him, starts saying things like wants death penalties for drug peddlers. So, in the liberal world, policy towards drugs is towards liberalizing the policy, saying that drugs are not are a medical problem. That people who take drugs are this type of people who are consumed by addictions. Maybe they have alcoholic addictions or any sort of addiction. So, why death penalties for drug addicts? It goes against logic, but yeah, he's saying this also, right? Death penalties for drug peddlers. And his logic, a man who is so moderate, so uh, He's not an extremist, but he is looking at the Singaporean model. He's justifying it, should be punished on the lines of Singapore. Drug peddlers kill people. These authoritarian instincts coming into a politician in a democratic setup, which is almost 50 years old, to be saying things like this is absolutely outrageous. Uh, then, so why is he saying these things? It's like, why is he making these statements? And he being a Democrat, he's a democratic man by nature. So then, Singapore becomes this sort of model in which societies all across Asia begin looking at. Is that because Singapore has a distinctly common history with the rest of Asia, but one thing that is very different from Singapore is its economy was never closed to the world. Uh, when the rest of Asia closed its economies to the world, Singapore remained open. And wealth was created at a level not seen in the rest of Asia or the developing world. So this kind of made politicians all across Asia, from Indonesia to even Goa, look at Singapore and start aping it in a way that sometimes, most of the times, did not look at Singapore critically. For instance, so just looking at the wealth of Singapore, they began emulating some of its authoritarian laws. So this is just not something that developing countries in Asia were doing. Like politicians all across Asia were looking at Singapore, but the Republican Party in America looks at Singapore as the ideal model of governance. And it's just not the Republican Party in the US. It is UK, the former colonizer, is looking at Singapore and speaking about Singapore in the terms of like looking at Singapore as something to emulate, right? So Singapore on the Thames is what Brexit was sold as. Okay, so then what is the Singaporean model, one may ask, that makes everybody around the world want to emulate this small tiny country? Okay, and everyone wants to emulate Singapore, but the way in which this small country has changed world history is the manner in which it has influenced China. So China also, like the rest of Asia, after its civil war, it shut itself off to the world, and it had a communist party that failed dramatically economically. In the 1970s, then they began to see that closing themselves off to the world, trying all these communist-led experiments, was detrimental to the economy. So then they began opening up to the world, and they began looking at various models all across the world to emulate. And so they looked at Sweden, but then they finally zoomed down to Singapore, and then Deng Xiaoping, he basically wanted to open up the economy, but he also wanted to maintain the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So then he looked at Singapore as the ideal model by which then this giant nation, giant influential nation, could entrench the interests of the Communist Party, but also open itself out economically, the way Singapore managed to do. So then there became this kind of Singaporean fever in China, like it is happening in the rest of Asia today. It happened in China, but this changed the course of world history, because when China opened itself out to world trade changed dramatically. China became this giant, powerful nation, following this model of this tiny country, like It's 1/5 the size of Goa, so it's so small that it would fit in Bardes, Tiswadi, and Salsette. It's that small, and it's changing the nature of global politics, right? So, uh, what is it in this model then that makes it so unique? And so the Singaporean model is actually not, it comes from other historic models where authoritarian rule has been used towards economic progress. Okay? So it's not a new model, it's not something they've invented. And Japan has always traditionally been seen in Southeast Asia, or East Asia, I mean, as the light of Asia. It's the beacon of Asia, it's the industrial hub of the continent. So, Singaporean society has traditionally looked at Japanese society as a way of emulating another society. So, this authoritarian-led development comes from the opening up of Japan. So, Japan was a feudal, aristocratic led country, like a country with a feudal aristocracy, and then it opens itself out to the world in the late 19th century. And the Meiji reformers basically choose the Prussian path. The Prussian path is a German authoritarian-led development in which a tough ruler like kind of silences dissent in society, but he delivers on economic outcomes. Okay, so the Singaporean model has to be seen from that context. It's decolonizing society in Asia, looking at another Asian power, that is Japan, which in turn is looking at another European power, that is Germany. Okay, so they're not looking at the UK, which is democratic, or the US, which is democratic, but they're looking at Germany, and because Germany is also an industrial power, and the difference is that Germany doesn't have colonies, so it is a country that one could emulate without problems. So one of the immediate impulses of Asian leaders is to think that this Prussian model is about a kind of dictatorship of a strong man who can deliver on economic growth. Now, this is far from the truth when it comes to Singapore. So, Southeast Asia and Asia, Africa has been full of dictatorships, right? And they've almost 99% of them have been abject failures, right? So, there is this disjunction. It's not that dictatorships lead to economic progress. Most of the time they lead to massive economic failures, like Pol Pot being a great example of this. So what one misses out in Singapore is, in this Prussian model, is that one has to look at the history of Singapore also. It's just not its authoritarian leaders asking their people to sacrifice political freedoms to deliver economic growth. Many countries across the world have tried this and have failed dramatically. Okay, so there's something else that is making this model work, where it's failed everywhere else. So this is, one has to see Singapore in the context of its location, and every city or every society in the world that has acquired wealth at any period in time has acquired wealth because it was strategically located in the right trading zone. Okay, so once trade disappears or trade appears, wealth comes and wealth goes also. So Singapore has been very lucky with its location in the last 200 years, because this area has been under ferment, but it's also located in an extremely favorable trading environment. So if you see the trading networks, so you see which are the rich parts of the world. One would say North America, and one would say Europe, right? So just look at the blue lines. and see the amount of trade happening in that region. And so trade leads to whatever, grand cities, big fancy infrastructure, but also very, very rich people. So then if you see the way trade happens, colonial trade is happening. So it happens, it's transatlantic trade leading to the boom of America and Europe, but it's also moving towards Asia. So you're seeing trade moving towards Asia, and you can see that it's touching the western seaboard of India, right? But a lot of it is going to Southeast Asia, okay? Because Southeast Asia is also a traditionally very, very rich area of the globe. And when the British acquired colonies over there, or the Dutch and the other colonial powers, these trading networks began moving into these regions. So wealth started being created. Okay? So and Singapore was correctly located. It had the advantage of its location. But if you look at how trade has evolved, it's no longer just transatlantic trade in the way the colonial empires operated. It is now moving more towards Asia. And with the development of the Suez Canal, one sees that it has dramatically reduced the distance from East Asia, that's China and Japan, to Europe. So when trade is flowing through these areas, the cities on these trade routes are becoming very rich. So there is no Bombay before the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal comes and a city arises because it's tapping into this trade. So the same thing happens in Singapore. It has tapped into these colonial trade networks, and now it is tapping into another round of global trade because of its ideal location. Okay, so one has to keep this in mind. This Singaporean model is because it is ideally located also. Okay, so it is located on a trade route, and a trade route is leading to the creation of this wealth. Okay, so what is the difference between, say, Singapore and other Asian countries also is it has a very different history from other parts of Asia. So Asia, like Africa or like Europe, old world countries. So they've had established populations for a very, very long time. Okay? So what happens when you have an established population, it is very difficult for new people to come and establish themselves in society. So when new traders try to come and establish themselves in an old society, they aren't given that space to operate. But so this is what happens all across Asia. It's very difficult. I mean, for you to be a trader and you to do well, one has to go through enormous difficulties. But what the British managed to do is that they managed, so Sir Stamford Raffles acquires a small island in the Malay archipelago that is thinly populated by small amount of tribes. So it doesn't have that old world conditions of the rest of Asia. So he's acquired this island from the Dutch. It has nothing in it, and then he lays out a small trading post and a small backbone that goes to form the city. So this is called the Jackson Plan, and the Jackson Plan is a typical colonial town that is deeply influenced by the cities of Madras and Calcutta. The same town planners that were planning the same systems that were planning these Indian cities has laid out this small strip of land in a small nondescript island in Singapore. But what one what one notices in this plan, if you look very closely, it is deeply racially segregated. Okay, so you can see a European town, that's the white town. You can see an Arab quarter, you can see a Chinese area, and racially it is totally divided. So this is the way a colonial town operated, and it is on these layers that a new global city arises and a new global society arises. So this plan is very, very common with the colonial towns in India, with a very, very different different set of problems for the British town planners. So if you look at how small Singapore is, you see the Jackson plan, how it starts. It just starts as a small layout on the southern tip of the island, and it is from here that the British are able to tap into this trade that is happening all across Southeast Asia. Okay, so the British traders then enter over here and they create a new town. There is no established population over here, and if one sees the Jackson plan, if one notices over here, it is so small that one is pushing against the Malayan jungle. Okay, so it's a small strip of settlement that is fighting for its survival against the larger jungle. So establishing itself, it's like establishing this colony, this small settlement over here is more than a challenge for the British. Okay, so this small trading post that gives rise to Singapore then begins cornering more and more trade in this region, because traders are able to establish themselves, and this is where the wealth of Singapore is initially developed. Okay, so now what is the major difference? Is that why can't Indian cities suddenly become like Singapore? What is the fundamental difference because it was planned by the same planners, there was same empire in operation. Why is this one country able to do so well, whereas all across Asia other countries have been struggling with town planning, dealing with migrants coming from this hinterland, etc. One just has to look at the case of Bangalore. So while laying out the small towns of Bangalore, the history of the Indian subcontinent is very, very different from that of Singapore. So after 1857, the British live in a complete fear that the natives are going to rise again. So the 1857 shook the empire from its foundations, and what that did was it created this kind of paranoia in empire, and this was reflected in colonial town planning. Look at this map of Bangalore. So what one sees is a huge garden that separates the cantonment area from the native town. So traditionally, prior to the British coming, an Indian town would have a kind of template that repeated itself across the subcontinent. You would have a fort. Around the fort, you would have a pate area, and over that then you would have a colonial settlement. Okay? So the major difference here is the fear of 1857 repeating itself, and what this does is it creates two cities. It creates city, a white city and a black city. So this happens at a very, very large scale, like a native town and a European town, and it's separated by these large buffers, because it would give the British Army enough time and enough space to put down a revolt if the natives came to overwhelm the cantonment. So, in the rest of the world, an army doesn't work in this cantonment culture. This cantonment culture is a type of occupation. It's a permanent occupation by the army. So it's coming here, it's occupying land and making sure that the natives are kept in place. But if you look at the plan, if you look at the plan of Bangalore, you see the other areas planned around Bangalore. It is very similar to Singapore. So it is, whereas in Singapore you have the ethnicity is separated. Here in India you have both the religions and the castes totally separated. So you have a modern European town plan, but you have it separated by caste and religion. So the models of operation are the same, but it's just that the histories of the cities are so different because of the events leading to their formation. So if you see the cantonment of Singapore, there is no buffer. It is literally part of the urban fabric. So that has been something that it is a base layer that was very favorable to the country once it gained its independence. Those harsh divides that you see, harsh colonial divides that you see in the big Indian cities, does not exist in Singapore in the way it exists in South Asia because of the manner in which these cities were planned. So these cities were, Singapore was planned for traders and to encourage trade, but they were also racially segregated. But they were traders, they were all coming to make money and they were coming from different parts of the globe. Whereas in India, it was not only trade, but it was the fear of the native revolt. So this is a base layer in which most South Asian cities have to deal with, and it's very, very difficult to overcome these colonial divides, is because on these divides we've built a modern nation. Okay, so Singapore has had this advantage that the different populations came, they did not upset established population, they came as traders and they came from trade networks, so everybody feels a sense of displacement. Everybody traces their ancestry to somewhere else. Okay? Whereas in India, if I'm from Goa, somebody else tries to come to Goa, there's always that tension that I'm going to be pushed out of my native place. So the DNA of the country is very, very different from the rest of Asia. It's very unique in that sense. Okay, so it does not have these harsh colonial layers. So this is one of the serious advantages that Singapore has had, is this colonial planning has been adopted by the modern nation state and it has been used, whereas in the rest of Asia there is a tendency to try to find ways to overcome these harsh colonial divides. It's because of the nature of the city. So here it's been very favorable to Singapore, whereas for the rest of Asia it's been very, very problematic for a new country to take on these layers. Okay. So we'll just look at the Jackson plan.
Singapore is known to be a very well-planned city, and we have a very strong heritage of urban planning. It takes its roots from colonial urban planning in British India, particularly in the cities of Calcutta and Madras. This is known as the Jackson Plan, was named after Lieutenant Philip Jackson, who was probably the first engineer and land surveyor in the colony of Singapore at the time. This was drawn up in 1822 originally, and it was commissioned by Stamford Raffles himself. There were two features of the urban plan in the cities of British India. The first feature was that the city was organized according to land use. Different pockets of Singapore are organized according to whether they are residential or commercial or civic.
So look at the fond way he's Singaporean. He's the director of National Museum, not the National Museum, the Asian Civilizations Museum. But look at the manner in which he's talking about a colonial plan. So fondly, he's saying, based on this plan, the modern nation has been formed, and he's extolling the good points of this plan, right? What would be the reaction in any other part of Asia? It would be something else. The British came, divide and rule. They laid waste to our economy. They looted us. But here, the rhetoric against colonialism is very, very different. It is because colonial trade has given rise to this nation. Right? So fundamentally, this is also very different. Is a very different kind of engagement with colonial trade. Whereas if you read the books of Shashi Tharoor, it's always about they have robbed us. They have taken our wealth and whatever, taken it to the UK, Kohinoor diamond. Here it is no. It is based on colonial town planning. We have gained from this. It is precisely because the colonial trade has established this nation with different people from all over the world, or all over Asia, and also other parts of the world, that gave rise to a new nation. So there was no established population to dispossess. Okay, so this is also one of the fundamental differences of the Singaporean model. Its engagement with empire has been favorable to the country because it is the foundations on which the country was built. It is a bit like America, in which they went and created these conditions of like a terra nullius, and then a new layer of people from all across the world have come and built a new nation. So its history, though being based in the old world, has a very distinct new world new world colonial aspect to it. Okay, so when we look at Singapore, one has to keep in mind that these colonial mechanisms in most parts of the world were brutal to the local population, but here it has been very advantageous to the country. Okay, so he makes this point, right? So he makes this point that the Jackson plan was the basis on which the entire country was formed. So in the previous slide, I showed you how this tiny plan, this tiny layout was fighting the jungle, but then it was built upon the same principles of the plan. British urban planning was used to develop the country going forward, because there was very little that they had to push back against the modern nation. Whereas here we had to deal with these deeply entrenched cantonment areas, black-white towns, all manner of colonial problems. Here, town planning was very, very favorable to the nation. So, there were these new towns, what they call. They established, like, so imagine the Jackson Plan was set up, and then you go and make new towns all across the country that are like a replication of this British town planning model. And they're all connected to each other. And this is the basis on which the country operates today. So one of the reasons why it has such low car ownerships is because of the manner in which the city is planned. The new town is planned in such a way that if you live in the new town, you also work in the new town, so that you don't have to get into a vehicle to go to work. So what that does is just the urban planning methods reduce the load of people on the road. Okay, so if you see the way these new towns have been laid, they have been connected extremely well, both by metro, bus routes, highways, etc. But they are self-contained, because even if you provide all the public transport in the world, you're still going to have to build a lot of roads if people have to go from one place to another to go to work. So this Jackson Plan then becomes the basis on which the nation is built, but they are self-contained. So it makes it very, very efficient. So you can't do this in places like Delhi, Karachi, Lahore, Bangalore, Calcutta. It is because the British town planning mechanisms and the town planners that they left are very, very different. They are there to maintain empire in a hostile environment, whereas here British town planning has been used to further the goals of the local population. Right? So what happens immediately after this Jackson Plan is formed? Trade also booms in this area. Right? So because of this plan, the traders are able to establish themselves in Singapore. This leads to the generation of wealth, but it also leads to people coming from all over the world, and this is the DNA of the country. So there are people who are moving from southern China, South India, there are Malays who are moving there, but everyone is moving towards Singapore. Okay, it doesn't have an established population, but the first elites to establish themselves in this area is a group of people called the Peranakans. So the Peranakans are Chinese traders who come, but they come without their women. So they are forced to marry locally, and so it's a mix of a Chinese man and a Malay woman. And what typically happens in communities like this is that they're caught in between. They're caught in between two ethnicities. One is who they've married and one who they've come from. But they completely align with the Peranakans, completely align with the British Empire. And this is the elite, the trading elite, that later gives rise to the aristocrat, the elites of Singapore. So it is this Peranakan elite, and it also attracts other people from all over Asia, and this is Little India. So people are coming because there's a promise of wealth and a promise of getting rich. So there is also now three distinct populations that form in Singapore. One is the Chinese, they call the Straits Chinese because they've been in the Straits of Malacca for so long that they've lost all contacts with China. So they're Chinese by ethnicity, but very little ties them to China. And there's also the local Malay population. Okay, so this is the DNA of the country, right? So this is, if you see the DNA of this country, very few countries in Asia or anywhere in the world, old world, Africa, Europe, Asia have this kind of original DNA in the foundation of the country, because everyone is come from somewhere else. It's more like a new world country. Okay, so what is happening is that there are many poor immigrants coming. There is a trading class, but there are these huge amount of very poor people escaping famines, wars from all over Asia, and then they're crowding this small trading hub, and there's a lot of population pressure. So this is the major races of Singapore. It's Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other, CMIO. So they come there. It's a transnational country in a sense. It's because the populations are from everywhere else. Okay, so one of the major. So Singapore is this place where one is making a lot of money. Poorer people are migrating. The empire is so invested in this place. They also treat it as a tropical paradise. It's a place where you go, have a good time, and there's no threat of any sort of revolt. Whereas if you were based in India, or the Indian subcontinent, there was always that threat. So they take it easy, and then in the 1930s, Japan is that country that is rising in Asia. It's an Asian power, and it is aiming to be similar to what another European colonial power is. So we're looking at grabbing all the European colonies in Asia, and to the Western colonial powers, this seems almost impossible, because they've been in these areas for so long, and they've established themselves militarily so strongly. They think it's almost impossible to be thrown out, specifically by an external force. And this is exactly what happens. If you see Singapore, it's a small trading hub that is attracting more and more migrants from all over the world, but it is a sea-facing state, in the sense of everything is looking, the trade, the military, everything looks towards the sea. Okay, but the Japanese notice this weakness in Singapore, and the greatest defeat till date on any Western power has probably been the defeat of the British from Singapore. So all was going well. There was no native uprising, but there's this external power that comes and grabs the city, because they invade from the guns of Singapore were aimed at the sea to protect sea trade. So the Japanese come from the reverse. They maneuver from behind and easily walk through the island. Okay. Yeah, this is 1942. World War II. So this is these were the two main combatants, Yamashita and Percival. And one can also see the kind of difference in kind of body demeanor. One nation is on the rise and the other is on the decline. Okay, so the destruction of Singapore was enormous. The Japanese entered Singapore, and trading hub, a formerly thriving trading hub, is completely destroyed. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, the Allies enter Singapore, but it's a different kind of society. It's because it's completely destroyed, and the trading networks have suffered greatly because the Japanese go after the Chinese men. and specifically there are mass murders of Chinese men, and that takes a huge toll on the trading community also because it was Chinese dominated. Uh, with the destruction of the British army and the British armed forces in Southeast Asia, it gave rise to a native aristocracy, a native, no, I would not say aristocracy, but I would say a native elite, much like it gave rise to a native elite all over Asia. Many of them were lawyers, and this is something you see in the independence movements all over Asia. In the British Empire, many of the freedom fighters, or the founding fathers of these nations, were lawyers. Okay, so while the engagement with colonialism was harsh in India, in Singapore it was not. But the destruction of the British by the Japanese led. It didn't lead to any sort of revolt, but it led to a kind of awakening among the locals that they couldn't depend on the British anymore because the British were completely destroyed, and so we have to look after ourselves. So India gets its independence in 1947, and Singapore is nowhere close to getting its independence because they don't want it, in the sense of there's no like uprisings, etc. But with the destruction of Singapore by the Japanese, there is a kind of feeling that we need to be like the rest of Asia. We need to ask for our independence too. So this is then what they're left with: a once thriving trading hub. Is not only very poor; it is the physical infrastructure is completely destroyed. And when the physical infrastructure was totally destroyed, it gave the town planners an ability to replan the entire country from bottoms up. Okay? So using all the British colonial structures, those were kept in place, and a new country was able to be established. So not only does it have populations from all over the world, it has to be rebuilt from scratch. So this is not something that one sees across Asia in that sense. Okay? All these forces coming together. This is London. So not only was the British forces in Asia completely destroyed, Britain itself was destroyed, right? So that led to the weakening of British power, and what happened over there was that it led to a large dissolution of British power, like colonial power, to the locals. Okay, so this is also very, very big difference. Is that there wasn't a sudden partition, there wasn't a sudden leaving of the continent. There was a slow dispersal of colonial powers from the colonial regime to the native elite. So the native elite then had an ability to rule in a far more rigorous manner, which the rest of Asia did not. So many of the newly independent countries of Asia fell into problems of, like civil wars, breakups, etc. But in Singapore, it didn't happen because the empire was slowly retreating and devolving power to the native elite. So the orderly departure of the British, it's a rare case where they departed in such an orderly manner, allowed for the new ruling class to get Western capital but also Western expertise, whereas all that was shunned in the rest of Asia because of the way the colonial networks operated. In Singapore, it was completely embraced. Okay, so they completely embraced Western capital and Western expertise, uh, whereas this is the foundation of the global outlook of the country. Okay? The rest of the world does not have this history, okay, where a newly established country is getting both Western capital investments and has Western expertise and has not closed itself out to the world, right? But it has other problems. It is a small country with populations that have lived with each other for less than 100 years or a little more than 100 years. Okay, there isn't a kind of understanding between the ethnicities the way it would be in a old world country. There's no established order in that sense. So it is known as the island of riots. Okay, so there's all manner of riots, and this is while the country is decolonizing, riots are just breaking out over all aspects of life, from bus fares to interreligious marriage, etc. We'll just see some videos on what the country, not only was it demolished by the Japanese, they were dealing with this problem of British law and order, like withdrawing and nothing fulfilling that gap. So there are riots happening all over. Okay, so what one sees here is the memory of the riots. Memory of the riots then is one of the fundamental. So this nation is rioting all the time over everything. Communities are going at each other, and law and order is completely broken down. Okay, so this is then one of the means, and also the violence is so much and loss of property is so much, right? Because the island is so small. This is something that the People's Action Party uses then. It uses stability as a means to justify its rule. It's not only economic progress, it is this memory of these riots that has scarred a new nation. So, in its housing policies, it is forced integration that they follow. Whereas the British were all about segregating people on their race, the new Singaporean government recognized that this was leading to a lot of racial tensions because people were very suspicious of each other. So it's not only ethnicity, it's also religion. It plays a very big part in the riots in Singapore. So there was this Maria Marto riot in which a Eurasian woman wants to marry a Muslim man, and both the communities then start contesting this. Okay.
In the riots, who are the two groups fighting against each other?
They are rioting over everything, including bus tickets. It's not two groups, it is generalized riots. It's because the empire is withdrawing itself and there is no law and order mechanism to take its place. It is like interracial riots is one aspect of rioting, but there are riots over jobs, a lack of jobs rather, interreligious marriages, bus fares, name it. It's a complete breakdown of order. But it is this vacuum that the People's Action Party then begins exploiting. Okay? And this is also the foundation why it is able to establish itself for such a long period of time. It's because the country realizes that if these riots keep breaking out, there will be no Singapore left because it's so small. Okay, so then stability then becomes one of the bywords for the People Action Party. The People Action Party is slowly pushing out the other political parties, and it's very attractive to the native population is because it's offering stability, but it's also offering like economic development. So then based on these riots, then they come up with a housing policy. They say these riots are not going to be able to sustain a new nation. So let's try and cool tensions down in our country by having a housing policy that offers everybody a stake in the country equally. Okay, so this is the memory of the riots is one of the reasons in which the government involves itself in housing the nation from its inception. So building a new nation based on housing is what Singapore is about also. Okay, so the entire government realizes that if these riots happen, everything is going to disappear. Okay, but they use the memory of the riots to both entrench their power, but also provide people with a house for themselves. So this is the rise of the public housing. So then social housing in Singapore is not only about providing a house, but also what it does is, what happens when you take populations of different ethnicities and mix them all up? What happens is this leads to, so there are elections held in Singapore, but this leads to the direct, how do you say, it leads to the entrenchment of Chinese rule in Singapore. That's because if there's no majority and minority areas and everybody is mixed in these GRCs, there's no social movement of minorities. So it's only like ethnic Chinese that get elected into majority positions in society. So this is a problematic aspect of the social housing. It's wonderful that there's mixing all these races, etc. But it also dilutes the votes of the minority communities. Is that they cannot vote in bloc to vote a candidate they want to vote for. They are all dispersed across the island, and Chinese candidates keep winning all over the. So it's social housing provides for a house for you, but it also takes away your kind of political rights along with it. So social housing in Singapore is a very, very political project. It has to be seen in this light. It's just not about constructing housing, it's also about entrenching the role of the People's Action Party. Okay. So going back to this, one of the reasons why it's able to attract so much of Western capital is because of also the nature of its politics. It doesn't see its independence as being an independence from the British Empire. It sees its independence as being independence from Malaysia after their federation was formed. So this also keeps the rhetoric against the West and the capitalist class of the West much lower. So its appeal is very, very broad based because the political rhetoric of the country also is very, very different. Okay, so when one of the reasons, reasons why Singapore is such a global society is because it does not have a hinterland. When it split from Malaysia, all the resources it had in the hinterland, tin, rubber, water, all remained in Malaysia. So the only way of staying alive as a nation was to trade globally and trade within the Western trade networks. Okay, so this thing about trade and Singapore is almost forced upon it. One is because of its size, and one is because it has to trade globally in order to survive. It doesn't have the resources. Even the water, all the water of Singapore comes from Malaysia. They have to, they really have to struggle to survive, and it's not only it not only has to survive, it has to constantly adapt. Okay. So this has given rise to a politics that is uniquely Singaporean. It is a government that delivers. It delivers on all its civic goals. In turn, the population gives up its political rights in order to get economic progress. But the Singaporean model is a very fragile model. It is not a model that can be replicated across the world because of the unique nature of Singaporean society. So, emulating its skyscrapers, its railway systems, its infrastructure, whatever, is missing the point. If one doesn't understand its history, one cannot learn from how it has achieved what it has achieved. Okay? So it is deeply paternalistic, it is deeply authoritarian, but it is also very wealthy, and it is a very, very fragile system that they have built. Okay, so I will just conclude by saying the Singaporean government promises law and order and delivers on it, but it is not the authoritarian tendencies that have given rise to this wealth. It's not that this dictatorship of the People's Action Party is giving rise to this wealth in a rather extraordinary way. The People's Action Party has socially engineered its society at all levels. So, in this statement, they make no apologies for a socially engineering society from the bedroom to the boardroom. There is a rule for everything. Okay, so there has also been in the past kind of eugenic experiments where they said where the founder of the country went as far as saying educated women give rise to smarter kids, so that we should encourage educated women to have more kids and less educated women to not have kids. It's so problematic. The interference in people's lives happens at all levels. Okay? So this is under strain, and this model cannot survive indefinitely. It's not a resilient model. It is a model that has existed due to the unique nature of its history. And I'll give you a small example of how race plays out in despite all its control over racial rhetoric. This was a video that had come out. Okay. So this so what's happening is because race is so controlled that there's no outlet to discuss race, because whenever there are problems in religion, race, etc., there needs to be conversations held, and this is not happening in Singapore. It is all controlled, and racial conversations are only allowed at the level of the elite. If you are an Indian or a Malay and you feel slighted by a Chinese person, there is very little outlet for you to have that conversation. Okay, so this Indian rapper got very offended that a Chinese actor put on brown face and started behaving like an Indian to sell a product. So this is her response. So there are the underlying racial layers and tensions of Singapore are there. But a video like this, if it was made in America, would anybody lose even half a day's sleep on this? You would not. But this created a national scandal that she was so bold enough to go and like directly address the issue of race head on. It is because these conversations are pushed under the carpet in an authoritarian system. So while the system delivers on economic growth, there are many people who feel left out of this wealth that is being created. And Preeti Nair is one, because she is an artist and she feels that no matter what she does, she'll always be a second grade artist in Singapore. So she made this video and everybody from the police to the home minister came down on her, right? So this is the fragility of this model, of the Singaporean model. It is not a resilient model. It has used the memory of the riots to come to deliver on social housing, etc. But there is a growing resentment happening in Singaporean society, and these racial politics, these racial quotas are becoming more and more absurd. It's like it's not having these racial conversations are not happening at the level of the street. They're happening at the level of the prime minister and an elite coterie of ministers. So that is putting an extreme pressure on the political system. So it has delivered on everything, but it is also under severe stress. Okay, and when you have an elite, that has delivered over the last 50 years such extraordinary wealth, there's also a tendency to have a self-referential system of meritocracy. It prides itself of being completely merit-driven society. But what is happening is Lee Kuan Yew's son is now the prime minister. So how meritocratic can it be if the father is passing on political powers to the son? So this model is under strain is because also the ruling elite are completely losing touch with what is happening on the ground. So the Singaporean model has delivered, but it is also under severe strain. Okay, thank you.